It is the depths of winter, 1941, somewhere in the Tatra Mountains along the border between Slovakia and occupied Poland. The temperature has fallen to minus 30 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin blisters within minutes and breath freezes into a fine white crust on wool scarves. A lone skier moves through the darkness, following a route she has traveled before, guided by a member of Poland's Olympic ski team who knows these slopes the way other men know their own gardens. She carries almost nothing that would draw suspicion. No weapon, no obvious contraband. Just a pair of leather gloves, ordinary in every way except for what has been sewn into the lining. Rolled tight inside that lining is a strip of film no larger than a matchbook, and on that film are photographs of documents that, if genuine, describe German military preparations along the Soviet frontier. She does not know, not with certainty, whether the men who gave her this film can be trusted, or whether the checkpoint ahead will be manned by soldiers who search gloves. She knows only that the alternative to trying is doing nothing, and doing nothing has never been in her nature. Her name, on the documents she carries, and the identity she has built, is not the one she was born with. To the British officers who will eventually receive what she is carrying, she is simply their agent in Budapest. To history, she will become Christine Granville, and this narrow, freezing mountain pass is where one of the more remarkable intelligence careers of the Second World War, quietly, almost invisibly, does its work. What she is attempting to smuggle across this border, and what it may or may not have meant for the war that followed, is a story that has been polished by decades of retelling into something close to legend. Separating what can be documented from what has simply been repeated is, itself, part of the story worth telling. To understand why a Polish countess turned skiing courier mattered at all, it helps to understand how badly Britain needed eyes inside occupied Europe in the first years of the war. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the country did not merely lose a war in the conventional sense. It lost its government, its army command structure, and very quickly, its ability to communicate anything reliable to the outside world. Britain, meanwhile, was fighting almost entirely blind. Photographic reconnaissance from aircraft was in its infancy and could only show what the camera happened to catch from altitude, not what was written on a general's desk. Code breaking at Bletchley Park was still years from the industrial scale it would later reach, and even once Enigma traffic began to be read, decrypts needed corroboration from human sources to be trusted and acted upon. What existed in the way of human intelligence networks inside occupied Poland in late 1939 was fragmented, improvised, and desperately short of a reliable channel to carry information out. Couriers were being caught. Radio operators, when they existed at all, had equipment that was heavy, easily detected by German direction-finding vans, and liable to get an entire network rolled up in a single raid. The problem, stated starkly, was this. Britain suspected that Adolf Hitler, having signed a pact of non-aggression with the Soviet Union in 1939, might nonetheless turn his armies eastward once Western Europe had been dealt with. But suspicion was not proof, and Whitehall could not act on rumor alone, particularly when Joseph Stalin himself was dismissing British warnings as attempts to provoke him into a war he did not believe was coming. What was needed was not another guess. It was documentary evidence, carried by someone resourceful enough to get it out, and brave enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough, to keep trying after the first attempt failed. Very few people fit that description. Krystyna Skarbek, a 31-year-old Polish aristocrat with no formal training in espionage, somehow did. Skarbek's route into this world had nothing to do with any recruiting office. When Poland fell, she and her husband, the diplomat Jerzy Gizicki, made their way to London, and rather than wait to be asked, she walked into a meeting with an intelligence officer named George Taylor and proposed her own operation. She would travel to Budapest, still neutral and still friendly enough to Poland to allow relatively free movement, and from there, she would ski across the Tatras into occupied territory, delivering money and propaganda material to whatever remained of the Polish resistance, and, more importantly, bringing information back out. It was an extraordinary proposal from a woman with no formal training, and it was approved largely because nobody had a better idea, and because Skarbek herself was almost impossible to refuse. In Budapest, she met Andrzej Kowarski, a one-legged Polish former army officer who had lost his leg years earlier in a hunting accident and who was already running an informal escape line for Polish soldiers trying to reach Allied forces in the West. Together they built what became known, rather theatrically, as the Musketeers Network, a loose but effective chain of contacts stretching from Budapest into Warsaw and back. The mechanics of the operation were unglamorous by design. Skarbek would cross the mountains, sometimes on foot, more often on skis, carrying cash, forged papers, and printed material for the resistance, and she would return carrying whatever intelligence her contacts had managed to gather in the interim. Documents that could not simply be carried as paper, because paper was bulky, incriminating, and impossible to conceal quickly if a checkpoint turned hostile, were photographed and reduced onto strips of film using the compact cameras that had become the standard tool of clandestine intelligence work by the late 1930s, devices roughly the size of a cigarette case that could turn a full page of typed German military orders into a frame of film smaller than a postage stamp. That film could then be rolled tight and hidden almost anywhere, in the seam of a glove, beneath a bandage, inside the false bottom of a wash bag. It was, in effect, a portable library, reduced to a size that could pass through a border guard's hands without ever being noticed, provided the person carrying it kept her nerve. Skarbek, by every account of those who worked alongside her, had nerve to spare. She was fluent in French and passable in several other languages, an accomplished skier and horsewoman since childhood, and possessed of a manner that colleagues described as almost unnervingly calm under pressure. The sort of calm that made German officials more likely to wave her through a checkpoint than to search her thoroughly. On at least one occasion, when a car she was traveling in broke down at a German checkpoint between Hungary and Yugoslavia, she is said to have talked the soldiers manning it into helping push the vehicle across the border themselves, an anecdote so improbable it sounds invented, and yet it is the kind of story that recurs, in one form or another, throughout her file. The most consequential of her runs, and the one from which her later reputation largely stems, came during the winter of 1940 into 1941, when she is credited with bringing out microfilm containing evidence of German military preparations along the Soviet border, material that appeared to confirm what British intelligence had suspected but could not prove, that Hitler intended to break his pact with Stalin and invade the Soviet Union. Operating out of Budapest, under the increasingly threadbare cover of a journalist, Skarbek and Kowarski were themselves living under a cloud of suspicion for much of this period, partly because Polish authorities in exile worried, not unreasonably given how compromised so many networks had become, that any operation running as smoothly as theirs might have been penetrated by German counterintelligence. In January 1941, that suspicion very nearly ended her career and her life. She and Kowarski were arrested by the Gestapo in Budapest and held for interrogation. Rather than wait to see what the Nazis intended, Skarbek is reported to have bitten her own tongue repeatedly during questioning until she began coughing blood, feigning the symptoms of tuberculosis. A subsequent chest examination, complicated by genuine lung scarring she carried from years-old exposure to exhaust fumes in a Warsaw garage where she had once worked, appeared to confirm the diagnosis, and fearful of the disease, her captors released both her and Kowarski rather than risk further exposure. It is the sort of escape that reads like fiction, and it is worth being honest that no surviving Gestapo interrogation record has ever been produced to confirm the details precisely as they are usually told. The account rests substantially on Skarbek's own later retelling and on statements from Kowarski, both of whom had every reason then and later to present themselves in the most favorable light. What can be said with more confidence is that she and Kowarski were released, that German pressure on escape routes through Hungary was tightening rapidly by early 1941, and that shortly afterwards the pair were ordered out of the country entirely, traveling under new British passports and new names, hers now Christine Granville, a name she would keep for the rest of her life. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might think, and costs you nothing. Beyond that single most famous run, the pattern of her work in Budapest reveals just how improvised and personal this kind of intelligence gathering still was in the earliest years of the war. She traveled repeatedly under the guise of a journalist, a cover flimsy enough that it would not have survived close scrutiny, yet convincing enough, paired with her genuine charm and her fluent command of several languages, to get her past officials who had no particular reason to look twice at a well-dressed Polish woman asking polite questions. Her contacts inside occupied Poland were themselves ordinary people taking extraordinary risks: railway workers who noticed troop movements, clerks who copied documents before they were filed away, former soldiers who had simply refused to accept that the war for them was over. None of this had the structure of a modern intelligence service. There was no fixed budget, no standard equipment issue, no formal chain of command beyond Skarbek and Kowarski's own judgment about who could be trusted and who could not. Money that reached her from London had to be smuggled in the same way information was smuggled out, and more than once the operation survived on whatever cash Kowarski could raise privately when official channels ran dry. The psychological toll of this kind of work rarely makes it into the official record, but it is not difficult to imagine what it meant to cross that same stretch of mountain again and again, never entirely certain whether the previous crossing had gone unnoticed or whether a patrol was simply waiting for the next one. It is worth setting Skarbek's methods alongside those used elsewhere in occupied Europe to understand what made her particular contribution distinctive. German counterintelligence, principally the Abwehr and later the Gestapo's own security service, relied heavily on informants, direction-finding equipment for radio transmissions, and the systematic infiltration of resistance cells, a strategy that proved devastatingly effective against networks that depended on fixed safe houses or repeated radio contact, since every transmission was a chance to be triangulated and every safe house was a chance to be betrayed. Skarbek's operation, by contrast, depended on almost none of that infrastructure. She carried information physically, in person, across terrain that German patrols found difficult to cover comprehensively, and she varied her routes and her cover stories enough that no single point of failure could compromise the whole chain. Compare this with other Allied networks operating in France around the same period, many of which depended on clandestine radio operators whose life expectancy, once captured German direction-finding technology improved from 1941 onwards, could be measured in weeks rather than years. The Special Operations Executive would later come to rely on wireless operators extensively across occupied France, and the casualty rate among them was appalling, precisely because a transmitter, however carefully concealed, still had to broadcast a signal that could be traced. A courier crossing a mountain pass on skis left no signal to trace at all. American intelligence gathering in the same period, still finding its feet through the fledgling Office of Strategic Services, tended to favor larger, more heavily resourced operations with dedicated wireless links and support staff, an approach with real advantages in volume and speed, but one that required infrastructure Poland's shattered resistance simply did not have in 1940. Skarbek's method was, in a sense, intelligence gathering reduced to its most stripped-down form. No radios, no elaborate equipment, just a person willing to keep making a genuinely dangerous journey until the information got through. What actually happened to the intelligence once it reached London is, honestly, harder to pin down than the popular version of this story suggests. The claim, repeated across countless retellings, is that Skarbek's microfilm was instrumental in confirming to Winston Churchill that Germany intended to invade the Soviet Union and that Churchill subsequently called her his favorite agent as a direct result. Churchill did, by multiple accounts, refer to her in exactly those terms at some point during the war, and Germany did invade the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, just as the intelligence she is credited with carrying suggested it would, but serious historians who have examined the broader intelligence picture caution against treating any single courier run, however dramatic, as the decisive piece of evidence that changed British or Soviet behavior. Britain was receiving warnings of a German attack on the Soviet Union from a wide range of sources throughout the spring of 1941, including diplomatic channels, defector reports, and eventually signals intelligence, and Stalin, famously, chose to disregard nearly all of them regardless of their origin, convinced that Hitler would not break the pact so soon. Skarbek's contribution, in other words, almost certainly formed one thread among several rather than the single decisive strand, and the definitive documentary record proving exactly what her film contained and exactly how it was used within British intelligence has never been fully and publicly reconstructed, in part because so much of the relevant SOE material remained classified for decades after the war. What is not in doubt is that she performed the mission repeatedly at extraordinary personal risk, and that her superiors within SOE regarded her as one of the most effective field agents they had, a judgment that would be reinforced many times over during her later work in France, most famously in 1944, when she talked a German commander into releasing two SOE agents, Francis Kamertz and Zan Fielding, hours before their scheduled execution, using nothing but nerve, bluff, and a substantial bribe. The wider legacy of what Skarbek did in those Tatra crossings extends beyond any single delivered document. Her success and her survival helped convince skeptical SOE planners that women could operate effectively as field agents in occupied territory, a case that had genuinely been in doubt at the outset of the war, and the organization would go on to recruit and deploy dozens of women across occupied Europe over the following years, several of whom paid for that work with their lives. She became, by the war's end, the longest-serving of all Britain's wartime women agents, and one of the very few to survive the conflict at all, having operated continuously from December 1939 through to VE Day. Ian Fleming is widely believed to have drawn on her at least in part when creating the character of Vesper Lynd for his first James Bond novel Casino Royale, though Fleming himself never confirmed the connection in so many words, and the claim, like much else in her story, sits somewhere between documented fact and enduring myth. She was awarded the George Medal and made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire in recognition of her service, decorations that placed her among the most highly honored of Britain's wartime women agents. Her file, along with much of the rest of SOE's wartime paperwork, remained closed to public view for decades, which is part of why her story circulated for so long, largely through word of mouth and post-war memoirs, rather than through primary documentation, and why so many of the specific details, the exact date of the crucial crossing, the precise contents of that strip of film, remain frustratingly difficult to verify against a hard paper trail even now. Return for a moment to that mountain pass. A woman alone in temperatures that would kill an unprepared traveler within hours, carrying nothing more dramatic in appearance than a pair of gloves, moving through darkness towards a border that could end her life if the wrong patrol happened to be standing at the wrong crossing point that night. She did not have the backing of a well-funded intelligence apparatus behind her, not yet, not in any way that would have felt reassuring in that moment. She had a route, a guide who knew the mountains, and her own considerable nerve. What she achieved, across dozens of such crossings over more than a year, was not a single decisive act that won the war on its own, because very few single acts ever do that, however much the retelling might want them to. What she achieved was something harder to dramatize, and in its way, more impressive. A sustained, repeated willingness to do an almost impossibly dangerous thing again and again, long after most people would have judged the odds too poor to continue, at a time when Britain had almost no other way of seeing into occupied Poland at all. She was arrested and talked her way free. She was suspected as a double agent by her own side and cleared her name. She crossed some of the most unforgiving terrain in Europe in some of the worst winters on record, carrying information that may or may not have swayed the fate of a continent, and she kept doing it because the alternative, doing nothing, was never a choice she was prepared to make. Whether any single piece of film she carried changed the course of the war is a question history cannot answer with total certainty. What history can say with confidence is that a Polish countess with no formal training, operating largely on instinct and sheer will, became one of the most effective intelligence operatives Britain fielded in the entire war, and that she did it in gloves lined with something far more dangerous: